On a street corner, Mrs. Letion stood still, her frail, petite figure blending like a shadow against the brick wall behind her. The old raincoat, worn and torn at the shoulders, clung to her body, barely enough to shield her from the piercing year-end winds. Her hands trembled slightly, one gripping a smooth, weathered cane, the other clutching a crumpled fabric bag, as if everything she owned was contained within it. From a distance, Mrs. Xuan stared intently toward the end of the alley, where a luxurious car had just glided to a stop, its headlights cutting through the dim surroundings. A flicker of tension crossed her face as her eyes tracked every movement, yet she remained in the shadows, an anonymous observer, unnoticed by those around her. No one realized that she stood there, not by accident, nor by the hand of fate. Mrs. Xuan was not a wandering beggar, despite what her worn appearance suggested. Beneath that weathered exterior beat the heart of a mother who had spent countless sleepless nights worrying, determined to protect the only happiness in her life. She was carrying out a test. A challenge she believed she had to see with her own eyes before she could entrust her daughter, Lin, to the man stepping out of that car. Nguyen Din Din Nam appeared before Mrs. Yuan. Tall, elegant, and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. A picture of perfection. But Mrs. Yuan was not easily deceived by appearances. A mother's seasoned intuition told her that sometimes perfection concealed hidden, unpredictable shadows. She remained motionless in the darkness, gripping her cane tightly, her eyes locked onto Nam. A storm of questions swirled in her mind. Who was this man, truly? Did he genuinely love her daughter, or was he merely wearing a mask of deception? Was he worthy of becoming part of her family? The thoughts gnawed at her, pulling her back into memories of women she had once known, women who had placed their trust in the wrong men, only to suffer irreversible misfortune. Mrs. Xuan told herself, tonight she would find her answer, no matter what it took. The car came to a halt. The door swung open. Nam stepped out, accompanied by a stylish young woman. Mrs. Xuan narrowed her eyes, lowered her head slightly, and moved forward. This was the moment she had long prepared for. Yet her heart still pounded fiercely in her chest, because what she was about to do would determine her daughter's future, and perhaps even her own. Mrs. Yuan, a woman past 50, was the embodiment of hardship, of relentless love for her only daughter. Her life was like a river filled with rapids, flowing endlessly, despite moments when it seemed on the verge of breaking apart. Her husband had passed away when leaving their daughter was too young to even say the word father, leaving Mrs. Xuan to bear the weight of being both mother and father. Through those years, she never had a single day of rest. Her calloused hands had held a hoe, a broom, a needle and thread, anything to earn a few coins to keep her daughter in school. To her, Lin was more than just a child. She was everything, her pride, her hope, and the very reason she continued to live. Mrs. Yuan had dreamed, in silence, of a day when Lin would have a better life, one free from the hardships she herself had endured. But it was precisely that immense love that made her worries grow with each step her daughter took toward adulthood. And when Lin announced that she wanted to marry Nam, a young businessman, Mrs. Yuan knew the moment of decision had arrived. At her age, Mrs. Yuan couldn't help but feel both relieved and anxious. According to Lin, Nam was the perfect man, successful, sophisticated, from a wealthy family, and, most importantly, deeply in love with her. Hearing this, Mrs. Xuan felt somewhat reassured. But as a mother who had seen much in life, she knew that surface beauty often concealed hidden complexities. Gradually, through her brief encounters with Nam, Mrs. Xuan began to notice details that others might easily overlook. During their first family meal, she observed that Nam only touched the expensive, elaborate dishes while avoiding the simpler, more traditional ones like vegetable soup or braised fish. This made her wonder, could someone so particular truly fit into a modest family like hers? The more Lin shared about Nam, the more uneasy Mrs. Xuan became. Lin said that Nam was extremely busy, rarely having time for her. She mentioned that he often had to travel for work, sometimes going an entire week without seeing her. With her gentle and trusting nature, Lin always found ways to justify his absence, believing in the man she loved without question. But Mrs. Xuan couldn't. She wondered whether Nam's busy schedule was real or just an excuse. If he truly loved Lin, why wasn't he willing to spend more time with her? Every night, Mrs. Xuan lay awake, her thoughts spiraling endlessly. She had seen so many women blinded by love, only to suffer a lifetime of heartache. She couldn't let that happen to Lin, the daughter she had spent her entire life protecting. She couldn't bear to see her step into a marriage where happiness was nothing more than a facade. Did Nam genuinely love Lin, or was she merely a piece in the perfect picture he was trying to paint? That question haunted her. How could she entrust her daughter to a man she barely knew? How could she she remain silent and do nothing, only to one day watch Lynn's tears fall in heartbreak? After countless sleepless nights, Mrs. Swan made a bold decision. She would uncover the truth herself, but not by asking directly, because she knew that a man like Nam would never reveal his true nature so easily. Instead of believing mere words, she would test him in a way he would never expect. Mrs. Yuan decided to play the role of a poor, helpless woman, a stranger in need, to see Nam's true nature. She told herself that if Nam was truly kind, he wouldn't hesitate to help someone completely unknown to him. And if he was sincere about Lin, his kindness would reveal itself naturally. With that thought, she began preparing for her plan. A set of old clothes, a tattered conical hat, worn-out sandals, and a frayed fabric bag, these were all she needed to disguise herself as an impoverished woman. She knew that only by doing this could she truly see Nam for who he was without being blinded by his polished exterior. Her plan was ready. All that remained was to wait for the right moment. Inside her was a mix of hope and anxiety. She hoped Nam would prove himself worthy of Lin's love, but at the same time, she feared that what she would witness might break her heart. No matter the outcome, Mrs. Xuan was prepared to face it. Because for a mother, nothing mattered more than protecting her child's happiness. A surge of anxiety roared inside Mrs. Yuan like an unstoppable undercurrent, pushing her to the edge of endurance. For countless nights, she lay on her old bamboo bed, eyes fixed on the darkness, her mind replaying the same unanswered questions over and over again. She knew that time waited for no one, and if she didn't act now, she might spend the rest of her life drowning in regret. She had to uncover the truth, but not with empty words, nor by questioning Lin or Nam. She knew that would only lead to the answers they wanted her to hear, not the truth she needed. She needed another way, a way to see Nam's true nature when he wasn't prepared, when he had no time to put on a mask. Then, a bold idea struck her. She would disguise herself as a beggar. The thought initially sent a shiver down her spine, but the more she considered it, the more sense it made. After all, a man's true character isn't found in his charming words, but in how he treats strangers, especially those who are vulnerable. If Nam was truly a good man, he wouldn't be able to ignore a poor woman in need of help. Mrs. Xuan began preparing for her plan. She rummaged through the attic and found items long forgotten. A faded, tattered outfit with frayed cuffs and hems, a conical hat so torn that only a few bamboo ribs remained, and a wrinkled fabric bag with seams barely holding together. An old pair of sandals she found in the backyard had worn down so much that they barely kept their shape. Looking at herself in the mirror, she let out a quiet sigh. The frail, weary woman staring back at her was the role she was about to embody. But a disguise alone wasn't enough. Mrs. Yuan also crafted a story she believed would stir compassion in anyone's heart. She would be a woman from the countryside who had lost all her money and had nowhere to go. Every detail of the story, from how a thief had stolen her wallet to her fear of returning home in shame, was carefully thought out. She wanted it to feel so real that no one would doubt it. Now, all that remained was waiting for the right moment. She was certain that Nam would come home late, and this was the perfect moment to put her plan into motion. It was a gloomy evening with a cold winter breeze sweeping through the streets. Wrapping herself in her disguise, she draped a tattered scarf around her neck before stepping out of the house. Her steps were slow, yet steady, her heart pounding with both anxiety and fierce determination. As night fell, the dim glow of streetlights flickered on, casting their yellowish hue over the bustling street. Mrs. Xuan positioned herself in a secluded corner near the alley where Nam lived, silently waiting. Her eyes remained fixed on the far end of the road, where the constant flow of vehicles blurred past. Her heart pounded. It felt as though she was stepping into battle. Am I going too far? A moment of hesitation crept into her mind, but it quickly faded as she recalled Lin's innocent gaze whenever she spoke about Nam. Lin loved him too much, trusted him so completely that she wouldn't be able to recognize anything out of the ordinary. As a mother, she couldn't just stand by and hope for the best. If something was wrong, she had to be the one to uncover it first. Time dragged on, the sound of traffic gradually fading, yet Mrs. Wuan remained there. Her hands gripped the fabric of her old cloth bag, as if searching for an anchor amid the storm of anxiety within her. The headlights of a distant car pierced through the dim alleyway, growing closer with each passing second. She hesitated for a brief moment as a sleek black car pulled up in front of the alley. The door swung open, and there he was. Nam stepped out, looking refined in his impeccably tailored suit. Beside him stood a young, elegant woman, dressed in a chic, fashionable outfit. Mrs. Yuan narrowed her eyes, her heartbeat quickening. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that could change everything. Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze never wavered from Nam. Taking a deep breath, she bowed her head slightly and began walking forward. Every step was filled with anticipation, each breath carrying the weight of what she was about to do, something that could alter Lin's future and perhaps perhaps even her own life. It was nearly 8 p.m. The yellow glow of the streetlights cast long shadows over the narrow alley, accentuating the stillness of the night. The rain had stopped long ago, but the air remained damp, and the occasional breeze carried a lingering chill. A luxury car approached slowly. Its headlights swept over the narrow street, illuminating puddles still glistening from the earlier rain. Nguyen Din Nam stepped out, tall, poised, and confident. Nam appeared in an elegant suit, his polished leather shoes gleaming under the streetlights. Every movement exuded the calm confidence and poise of a successful man. Walking beside him was a young woman with long flowing curls, crimson lips, and piercing eyes that radiated self. A designer coat draped casually over her shoulders, enhancing her air of refined elegance. They looked like a couple straight out of a glamorous world, so strikingly perfect that passers-by couldn't help but steal a glance. From the shadows, Mrs. X Yuen observed in silence. Clad in tattered clothes, she clutched a worn bamboo cane tightly. Beneath the frayed brim of her conical hat, her eyes gleamed with sharp awareness. She narrowed them slightly as she took in the sight of the woman beside Nam. A strange sensation crept over her. Hesitation, suspicion, and a tinge of unease. Who was this woman? What was her relationship with Nam? The question swirled in her mind, but she quickly regained her composure. This was not the time for speculation. She needed to focus on her plan. As Nam and the woman turned to enter the house, Mrs. Yuan made her move. Her steps were slow, her posture slightly hunched, and her trembling hand reached forward like someone in desperate need of help. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just from age or the dull ache in her joints, but from the weight of anticipation pressing against her chest. She lifted her gaze, her voice hoarse and unsteady. But her voice was filled with urgency. "Sir, please, could you spare me some money for bread? I'm so hungry, I don't even have the strength to walk anymore." The woman beside Nam immediately turned around. Her gaze swept over Mrs. Yuan's tattered appearance, cold and dismissive, as if she were looking at something insignificant. An inconvenience. She frowned, her voice sharp, almost like a command to drive her away. "Get out of the way. Stop bothering people. If you want money, go beg somewhere else." Not stopping there, she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a crumpled bill, and tossed it onto the ground, her tone dripping with condescension. "Take it and go. Don't stand here wasting our time." Mrs. Swan bent down to pick up the bill, her hands trembling, not just from the biting cold of the night, but from the wave of indignation and humiliation rising inside her. But before she could straighten up, a deep, steady voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "Wait." Nam stepped forward. His expression was serious, yet his tone remained calm. He bent down and picked up the bill. Nam gently took the bill from Mrs. Zuin's hand and placed it back into her palm. His eyes were filled with sincerity and quiet concern as he spoke. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for what my friend said. Please take this money, and if you need anything else, just let me know. I'll help you." His voice was not loud, but there was a calm confidence in his tone that made the woman beside him momentarily freeze. Mrs. Juan looked at Nam, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Such a small gesture, yet it brought a faint glimmer of light, easing some of the doubts in her heart. "Thank you, young man," she murmured, trying to conceal the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Nam gave a slight nod, then turned to the woman beside him and said firmly yet gently, "Next time, don't act like that. Respecting others isn't a choice, it's a way of life." His words left the woman momentarily flustered, but before she could respond, he had already walked ahead. Mrs. Juan remained where she was, watching as his figure disappeared into the house at the end of the alley. She thought to herself, does this action truly reflect his character, or was it just a fleeting moment to make an impression? I still need to find out. With that, she turned back to her familiar street corner, her heart weighed down by contemplation. But this time, a small glimmer of hope had sparked in Mrs. Xuan's heart, a hope that Na might truly be the sincere and kind man Lin had always believed him to be. But to be certain, she knew this was only the beginning. The test was far from over. Nam politely invited Mrs. Yuan inside. A modern and elegant space unfolded before her eyes. The apartment was tastefully arranged, from the cream-colored leather sofa that stood out in the living room to the lush green potted plants lined along the large window frame. Every detail, every corner exuded cleanliness, order, and the unmistakable wealth of its owner. Mrs. Swan hesitated slightly at the entrance. Her worn-out sandals felt out of place against the gleaming floor. Noticing her hesitation, Nam gave a gentle smile and said, "Please, come in. Don't worry. I just want you to feel comfortable." Hearing his words, she stepped inside and sat down on the plush sofa. The softness was almost unsettling. She clung tightly to her old wooden cane, seeking some form of grounding in this unfamiliar and overwhelmingly luxurious space. Nam sat across from her, his gaze respectful, neither impatient nor dismissive. He calmly asked. Nam's voice was gentle yet full of concern. "Would you like some orange juice? I can make you a glass." Mrs. Yuan nodded slightly, trying to maintain a composed expression. Nam quickly stepped into the kitchen, and just moments later, he returned with a fresh glass of orange juice and a small plate of pastries. Carefully placing them on the table in front of her, he smiled and said, "Please, have some of these pastries. It'll help with the hunger. I'll call a car to make sure you get home safely later." Mrs. Swan bowed her head slightly in thanks, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she took the glass. The refreshing citrus aroma seemed to chase away the lingering chill in her body. She took a small sip, sensing the care behind Nam's gestures, but she wasn't ready to trust just yet. After a brief silence, she carefully posed a question, one that seemed casual but was, in fact, a test. "A young man like you must have many admirers. Is there someone special?" Nam appeared slightly surprised, but soon smiled. His eyes lit up as he responded, "Yes, there's only one person I love, and she's my fiancée." Mrs. Wen paused for a moment upon hearing those words. The way Nam spoke about Lin, her daughter, with such warmth in his eyes and sincerity in his voice, sent a faint sense of comfort through her heart. But she knew that a few sweet words couldn't erase all the doubts she had carried for days. Feigning curiosity, she asked, "The woman you love must be very special. What is it about her that makes you love her?" Nam didn't hesitate. He answered immediately, his voice filled with pride and sincerity. "Yes, she's truly special. She's a simple person. She doesn't care much about material things, but she always thinks of others first. It's her simplicity and sincerity that make me love and respect her even more." Hearing these words, Mrs. Zhuan felt a slight sense of relief. There was something in the way Nam spoke that made it hard not to trust him, but she knew that to be certain, she needed to take her test further. She wasn't going to miss any opportunity to uncover Nam's true character. While Nam got up to clear the glass, Mrs. Zhuan took the chance to observe her surroundings. Everything in his home was neat and spotless, from the carefully arranged books on the shelf to the small details, like the framed photos on the table. But did this perfection reflect the real Nam, or was it merely a facade? She tightened her grip on the wooden cane in her hand. Her eyes flickered with a hint of determination. Her test was not over yet. She needed more time, more situations. She needed to truly see Nam's real character before making her final decision. Just then, the sudden ringing of a phone shattered the quiet atmosphere in the room. Nam glanced at the screen. His expression changed instantly, his eyes filled with concern. He stood up, his voice serious as he spoke into the phone. "An accident? Where?" "All right, wait for me. I'll be there right away." Mrs. Yuan remained still, but she didn't miss a single word Nam said. It seemed one of his friends had just been in a traffic accident. Without a moment's hesitation, Nam quickly changed clothes, threw on a coat, then turned back to Mrs. Yuan. "Please rest here for a little while longer. I have an urgent matter to attend to, but I'll come back as soon as I can to help you." Despite his urgency, Nam's voice remained respectful. Mrs. Yuan simply nodded in response. Yet, inside her, a sense of curiosity mixed with doubt tightened its grip. Nam hurried out the door, and the moment it clicked shut, Mrs. Yuan quietly stood up, gripping her old wooden cane firmly in hand. Mrs. Yuan gripped her cane tighter than ever. "I need to see what he's really going to do." She silently followed Nam. The night had fully settled in. Streetlights cast a dim glow over the quiet road, with only the occasional sound of passing vehicles breaking the silence. Nam strode quickly toward his car, opened the door, and sped off. Mrs. Yuan immediately hailed a motorbike taxi and followed, her eyes never leaving the luxurious car ahead. The car stopped near the city center, where the accident had occurred. A man lay on the road, his face contorted in pain. Several bystanders stood nearby, but no one dared to step forward. Nam rushed over without hesitation. He knelt down, carefully assessing his friend's condition. His voice was firm yet filled with concern. "Are you all right? Don't worry, I've already called an ambulance. You'll be okay." Nam pulled out his phone and called emergency services, his tone calm yet resolute. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived. Without hesitation, he helped the paramedics lift his injured friend onto the stretcher, unconcerned about getting his clothes dirty. When the doctor asked for someone to handle the hospital admission paperwork, Nam immediately stepped forward to take care of it. Nam immediately walked up to the reception desk, pulled out his wallet, and paid the entire bill without hesitation. From a distance, Mrs. Yuan watched everything unfold. Her heart tightened, a wave of emotion coursing through her. Nam's actions didn't just show responsibility, they revealed his sincerity and kindness. A person willing to help a friend in times of hardship without a second thought about cost or inconvenience was certainly neither heartless nor insincere. And yet, Mrs. Yuan wasn't ready to draw conclusions. A single good deed couldn't define an entire person. She needed more time to observe. When Nam returned, exhaustion was evident in his posture, but his eyes still reflected relief. Knowing his friend was in good hands, Before he could notice her presence, Mrs. Xuan turned away and left. On the way home, her thoughts remained restless. What she had just witnessed eased some of her concerns, but to be truly reassured, she needed more solid proof. He is kind, but is his kindness enough to protect my daughter? That question still lingered in her mind. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, Mrs. Xuan, appearing as a weary, impoverished woman, once again made her way to Nam's apartment. Her face showed a hint of hesitation, but her eyes remained resolute. What she had witnessed the night before had eased some of her worries, yet she knew that a few good deeds weren't enough to define a person entirely. Standing at the door, her hands gripped the wooden cane tightly, her legs trembling slightly. Taking a deep breath, she knocked gently. The soft sound of her knock broke the morning silence. Within seconds, the door opened. Nam stood there, holding a steaming cup of coffee in one hand. Upon seeing Mrs. Xuan, he looked momentarily surprised, but quickly replaced it with a warm smile. "You're here again, ma'am?" Nam asked, his voice gentle yet filled with genuine concern. Jeanne lowered her gaze, trying to steady her voice, though an unmistakable tremor lingered. I feel like I'm troubling you too much. I'm just a stranger, yet you've helped me so much. You're young, you've so many things to take care of. I don't want to take up any more of your time." Nam set his coffee down on a nearby table. His expression held a mix of surprise and Nam stepped closer, his gaze filled with empathy. His voice was gentle yet sincere. "Please, don't say that, ma'am. Meeting you is fate, and helping you is simply the right thing to do. In life, sometimes even a little help can ease someone's burdens. I'm not doing anything grand. Please don't overthink it." His words left Mrs. Xuan momentarily speechless. Her eyes flickered with emotion, though she struggled to hold it back. She shook her head slightly, her voice trembling. "But you've already done so much. I don't even know how to thank you. Honestly, I don't dare accept anything more from you." Nam smiled, his expression firm yet kind. "Please don't think that way. This is just a small gesture from me." With that, he pulled out a large bill from his wallet, carefully folded it, and gently placed it in her hand. The gesture wasn't just thoughtful, it was a rare display of true compassion. Holding her hand lightly, he added, his voice warm and steady, "Please take it. Don't feel hesitant. I just want to make things a little easier for you. If you ever need anything, just come to me. I'll help however I can." Mrs. Xuan stood still. Her hands trembled slightly. As she accepted the money, Mrs. Xuan's eyes lingered on Nam, searching for even the slightest trace of pretense or exaggeration, but all she saw was warmth and sincerity. I truly appreciate this." Her voice wavered, emotion flickering in her gaze. "You're a rare, kind soul." Nam gave a gentle smile, his expression calm yet reassuring. He walked her to the door, bowing respectfully, not as if she were a stranger, but as if she were family. Stepping out of the apartment, Mrs. Xuan held the bill tightly in her hand. Nam's words and actions from the very beginning, every small gesture, had left a deep impression on her heart. She walked slowly down the street, the sunlight casting soft shadows across her face, accentuating every wrinkle. On her way home, she couldn't stop thinking. What Nam had shown wasn't just kindness, it was thoughtfulness, sincerity, and a heart full of compassion. Still, she wasn't ready to make a final judgment. She needed to observe more, to be certain that her daughter had chosen a truly worthy man. As she passed through the bustling streets, a subtle sense of relief settled in her heart. Perhaps she didn't choose wrong after all, she whispered to herself, a faint yet warm glimmer of hope flickering in her eyes. But in the heart of a seasoned mother, caution still remained. She understood that her daughter's happiness was the most important thing, and she would do whatever it took to protect it. As she stepped out of Nam's apartment, Mrs. Xuan paused on the doorstep, turning back to glance at the door that had just closed. The morning sunlight reflected off the clear glass, casting back the image of a young man, genuine and sincere, a reflection that lingered in her thoughts. Her heart swelled with a mix of emotions, tenderness, relief, and a quiet sense of reassurance. Nam's actions, from his gentle care to his selfless kindness, were not just surface-level gestures. They carried something truly genuine, a man of responsibility, a heart full of compassion. Mrs. Xuan could sense that behind his polished demeanor was someone who truly cared for others, a man who could be a steadfast pillar of support for her daughter. She walked home slowly, her steps feeling lighter after days weighed down by uncertainty. Upon reaching home, she set her fabric bag and old walking stick down in the corner. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the bill Nam had given her and placed it on the table. Her gaze lingered on it, as if she could see the unspoken meaning behind his gesture. Wen entered the room, curiosity shining in her eyes as she saw her mother return from a mysterious trip she had never been told about. She stepped closer, smiling gently. "Mom, where have you been these past few days? I haven't seen you at home. Is there something you're keeping from me?" Mrs. Xuan looked up at her daughter, her eyes warm yet profound, holding an untold story within them. She smiled, a warm, heartfelt smile. It was rare for Lynn to see her mother smile like that. Mrs. Xuan gently said, I just had something to take care of. But now I'm at ease. You have chosen the right person. Live a happy life, my dear. Lynn widened her eyes, not fully understanding the meaning behind her mother's words. But in Mrs. Schwann's gaze and smile, she could feel her mother's approval and peace of mind about Nam. Holding her mother's hand, she softly said, "Thank you, Mom. I promise I will live well." Mrs. Schwann said nothing more, just gently squeezed her daughter's hand. Her quiet eyes traced every familiar feature on Lynn's face. The daughter she had spent her entire life protecting. All the worries, all the questions that had plagued her heart for days were now slowly fading away. Though she never spoke of everything she had done, Mrs. Schwann had found the answer on her own. Nam was not only a good man, but also mature enough to love and protect her daughter. Now she trusted him. She was ready to entrust Lynn's happiness to this future son-in-law. Mrs. Schwann returned to her daily routine. But her steps were lighter, her heart at peace. For a mother like her, knowing she had done everything to ensure her daughter's happiness, that was the most important thing in her life. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this meaningful and heartfelt story. Stories like these not only teach valuable life lessons, but also connect us to the deeper values of love, compassion, and selfless devotion. If you enjoyed this story and would like to support our channel, please click like to show your support. Share this story with your loved ones to spread its beautiful message. And don't forget to hit subscribe to receive more touching stories. Your support is our greatest motivation to continue bringing meaningful content to you. Thank you so much.